We've explored how complexity, change, and opacity interact to create delivery risk, especially via dependency visibility and decision latency. There's a structural factor that determines how strongly these factors affect performance, and that's executive governance. Governance is not simply oversight. It is the system through which decisions and commitments are made, information and vision are interpreted, and capital exposure accumulates. Experts create technical certainty, project management creates delivery structure, and leadership creates opportunity. Capital projects are the way strategic opportunity is made real. Governance defines how the opportunity is pursued under uncertainty. It determines whether risk is contained early or discovered late. As such, it is a capital allocation issue. Here's Gill and Fu. Our findings trace cost escalation to fundamental changes of the project governance structure and concomitant renegotiations of value to be created and the value distribution. On the other hand, the IMF cites good megaproject governance attributed for as much as an 82% reduction in cost overruns. At its best, governance allocates decision rights, clarifying accountability and stating what is needed for a decision. It aligns decisions with financial exposure, and it sets how and when escalations work. To Gill and Fu once more, in a megaproject, the organizational governance structure is thus responsible for the decisions that set the project performance targets for scope, cost, and end date, as well as that determine the focal organization's ability to stay or not within those targets. But governance also determines how uncertainty becomes commitment, and it's here that there can be risk. Projects operate with incomplete understanding, changing environments and evolving knowledge, and limited visibility into emerging constraints. Governance accommodates these unknowns and translates them into actions, shaping when decisions are taken, what evidence required, and whether assumptions are revisited, and how reversible commitments remain. In doing so, governance defines the project's exposure trajectory. Commit too slowly, and opportunity windows collapse. Commit too rigidly, and incorrect assumptions become embedded. High-performance governance stages commitment so learning occurs before capital becomes irreversible. Put another way, good governance ensures you understand as much as you can about your project before you start signing checks. In projects, financially decisive choices occur before delivery begins. These include investment approval, contracting strategy, risk allocation, delivery model selection, and sequencing assumptions. These decisions are made about future events. There are unknowns about the project, forecasts are unstable, dependencies are unclear, and technical certainty is incomplete. That incurs risks and can create a governance paradox. Early commitment creates direction and momentum, yet early irreversible commitment embeds untested assumptions. When those decisions become permanent, adaptation becomes constrained, commercial exposure accumulates, and political cost of change increases. Projects then continue on fragile foundations because reversing course becomes harder than continuing. Inadvertently, projects engineer the sunk cost fallacy into their own governance. But in the early phases of projects, where certainty is low, so is the cost of change. High-performing governance treats early phases as learning environments. Direction should be committed early, but assumptions should remain reversible until the cost of change rises sharply, which is a project point of no return, and that's usually when you begin to dig holes, cut steel, or pour concrete. Failure to manage this transition is a common source of structural project risk. Since we've talked about governance under complexity, let's discuss governance under changing conditions. Governance designed for stability can become dangerous when conditions are still evolving. Organizations can respond to uncertainty by increasing control. This includes additional approval layers, tighter assurance processes, more detailed reporting, and higher decision thresholds. While these measures aim to reduce risk, they can also slow response, compounding challenges faced in early complex project delivery. Escalation pathways can lengthen, teams can become cautious about raising emerging issues, and adaptation lags behind reality. A mismatch emerges. Under increased scrutiny and pressure, false certainty can creep in. Reversible problems can become irreversible, and exposure can grow even as oversight increases. Effective governance adjusts control intensity to match the stability of the decision environment. Responsiveness is a risk management capability, and control that arrives too late is an illusion. Next, we turn to governance under opaque conditions. The UK Infrastructure and Procurement Authority notes that capital project errors and overrun failures could be attributed, among other factors, to unclear governance and accountability. There are structural and behavioural forms of opacity, so let's look at structural first. Executives rarely experience projects directly, they experience representations of them. You've seen them as dashboards, traffic light systems, and PowerPoint reports. There's nothing wrong with that, provided that we acknowledge that it's a representation and not the real thing. Information is summarized, aggregated, delayed, and simplified to enable comparison and oversight. Governance defines how these representations are constructed. These mechanisms are necessary but can create structural opacity. Structural opacity in governance is where information that would affect decision-making does not appear in the right governance forum, either in time or at all. This is often an unintended result of governance that hasn't adapted to the complexity or change of the project. Local or detail-level risks may be diluted in program indicators. Emerging dependencies may not yet appear in formal reporting. In those situations, delivery reality moves in one direction and leadership perception moves in another. As a result, performance shocks then appear sudden, even when warning signals might have existed. Projects rarely surprise the people doing the work, but they do surprise the people reading the reports. Strong governance reduces the gap between what is happening and what leaders believe is happening. Behavioural opacity, as opposed to structural opacity, is where somebody has made a deliberate choice about the information required for governance, and it limits visibility in some way. Whether that's governance asking for the information or if it's presented in an unaligned way. Governance shapes behaviour. With respect to what I call behavioural opacity, some research emphasises incentive distortion, which can include things like when performance is judged against fixed plans, risk may be framed cautiously or escalation delayed. Or commercial positioning and contractual dynamics can influence how uncertainty is communicated. And conflicts of interest between client, contractor, and project management are always things worth watching. Other research highlights genuine complexity. Technical signals may be ambiguous, experts may disagree, and uncertainty may be scientific rather than strategic. In practice, both dynamics exist, and I've seen them. Teams are rarely trying to hide problems, but they may hesitate to surface uncertainty if governance responses are slow, punitive, or politically costly. Behavioural opacity emerges from the interaction between incentives, professional judgment, and governance climate. Effective governance does not assume perfect transparency. It creates conditions in which emerging risks can be surfaced while meaningful options still remain. Governance does not operate outside uncertainty. It shapes how uncertainty affects performance. Under complexity, it determines whether assumptions become irreversible commitments. Under change, it determines whether decisions adapt before conditions shift further. Under opacity, it determines whether risk signals become visible early enough to act. Governance therefore acts as a risk amplifier or a risk dampener. Depending on governance, the same technical challenge can remain manageable or become a structural crisis with the following factors: commitment timing and reversibility, visibility including visibility of information and who makes the decision, and escalation safety and timing. Projects do not fail because uncertainty exists. They fail when governance converts uncertainty into exposure faster than the organization can respond. Uncertainty is inevitable. Governance determines whether it becomes expensive. If governance shapes exposure, it must be treated as a design discipline. With respect to governance, leaders must ask, are decisions staged to support learning before capital becomes irreversible? What does decisiveness look like under uncertainty? Do reporting systems reveal instability honestly enough and early enough to act? And can delivery systems adapt without triggering governance paralysis? High-performing projects do not inherit governance. They engineer it to match the risk profile of the investment. There are two tensions to resolve, and the first is static versus dynamic governance. Traditional project management literature often views governance as a static, hierarchical, and binary process established firmly at the start of a project. This can be simpler to understand and thus communicate within. However, complexity research argue that megaproject governance must be time-dependent and self-organizing, continuously transforming and drawing on different governance regimes as the project unfolds through its long and turbulent life cycle, which can cater for the reality of a project at the potential cost of a more complicated governance system. Have a look at Decision Making on Megaprojects by Fluvia, Premius, and Van Wee. The second is the governance paradox, or authority versus consensus. There's a severe tension between the need to centralize authority to maintain tight control over scope and budgets with a hub and spoke model versus the need to share decision rights with a diverse stakeholder group to maintain public legitimacy. Sharing governance diffuses authority and routinely leads to consensus-oriented scope expansions that shatter the initial cost baseline, forcing executives to trade economic efficiency for social surplus. In some of the most challenging megaproject environments, this has required simplifying escalation pathways, redefining decision forums, improving visibility into dependencies, and aligning governance with how work actually unfolds. These approaches are not theoretical. They have been tested under conditions of extreme complexity and significant capital pressure. In the next discussions, we will examine practical governance and delivery models that help organizations manage uncertainty without sacrificing momentum.